What is every Resident Evil game's biggest strength? Resident Evil 0 is very divisive. The inventory system punishes you for not being psychic. The two-character setup creates logistical headaches that stop feeling creative after the first hour, and there are stretches of this campaign that feel less like survival horror and more like doing chores in a haunted house. Even people who genuinely enjoy RE0 usually spend the first half of any defense acknowledging how rough it is. What RE0 actually gets right is really expanding on the lore. Before this game, Umbrella was basically a logo attached to evil. You knew they were running experiments, you knew things had gone wrong, you knew they were behind everything, but the details stayed pretty vague because the mystery was doing most of the work. RE0 as a prequel set out to flesh out a lot of the explanations. It introduces James Marcus, who is one of Umbrella's 3 original co-founders, alongside Spencer and Edward Ashford, and builds out how the company's research actually began. The obsession with the progenitor virus, the leech experiments. For the first time, Umbrella stopped feeling like just this shadowy corporation, but actually got a lot more details about it known. You learn about the people behind it, their obsessions, what led up to everything in Raccoon City and beyond. And the Marcus storyline itself is also really interesting, because Marcus was eliminated on Spencer's orders, with Wesker and Birkin involved in the operation, and then Spencer moved on like it was a footnote. Like Umbrella wasn't corrupted gradually over time, it was just built on betrayal from the start, and the whole operation had been a ticking clock ever since. I think maybe my favorite part though is that it ends as RE1 begins, and if you play this before Resident Evil 1, it'll give you more context into that game, but being honest, I have a hard time recommending this to anyone unless you're just a huge Resident Evil fan. The whole item system here is just extremely frustrating, and if we actually are getting a remake like the rumors say, I would just wait for that. Before I continue, I just want to say, subscribe, and after you're done with this, check out the biggest issue in every Resident Evil game. And this video where I try to rage bait fans of every Resident Evil game. The original Resident Evil pretty much started the survival horror genre. While there were games before it, this is really what people think of when they think of pioneers of this game. The reason the remake really didn't change anything except better graphics and better controls and a few other touches here is because the Spencer Mansion is just such a fantastic location. You start with almost no sense of space, there's locked doors with no obvious keys, sounds coming through walls you can't get through, and you don't really understand what's going on at first. But over the next several hours, shortcuts start to open up, hallways that were once stressful become basically fast travel routes, and you go from navigating blind to really moving through the space a lot more confidently. And the fixed cameras do a huge amount of that work. Every room is of course framed to withhold something, and you walk into a hallway with the camera position at the far end, moving toward the screen with no idea what's around the corner, and then a cut to a new angle reveals an enemy that wasn't visible a second ago. Now personally for me, I prefer the over-the-shoulder camera, but a lot of people do prefer the tank controls with fixed cameras, and that's totally fine. But for the Spencer Mansion, I really understand why they went that way. Like there's just something about having one big mansion where the game takes place, where the puzzles actually make sense here. Like it makes sense for Spencer to design a mansion in this way, where you need to have emblems and random items to unlock new areas, because later on in the series, it's gotten a little ridiculous, where you walk into a hospital, and there's basically like a puzzle box that hides a bathroom key or something. And later games would go bigger in every direction. There's of course been cities, villages, entire regions, but the core idea of a central environment that reveals itself gradually was something that the series hasn't really gone back to. We got Resident Evil 7, which obviously took a lot of DNA from that game, but still was a lot different. And also, just to be clear, I'm not saying that this is necessarily better than other games. I'm just saying that it was a really cool concept and a very big strength for this game for what it set out to do. So I promise that not all these games are just going to be the locations, but the Raccoon Police Department, I think, is the best design location in any Resident Evil game. Spencer Mansion's up there, but that's also the entire game. This is just a section of it. There's a reason that Capcom likes to use this as nostalgia bait. What makes it work starts with how strange the building feels. The station looks like a repurposed museum, with a grand exhibit hall next to filing rooms and evidence lockers, statues in the lobby, ornate architecture that has absolutely no business being in the police precinct. And of course, lore does confirm that this was a repurposed museum. And this being the biggest strength is pretty similar to its prequel. It's just such an expertly designed area that has enemies placed in perfect spots. With a lot of backtracking here, that does make sense. Maybe there's a certain area that you have more trouble with and want to keep zombies out of. But as it goes on, you start to learn pretty much every hallway, and you start to get a good idea of where you need to go, what keys you need to bring where. And the building also just tells the story of the outbreak without stopping to explain it. Barricaded doors, abandoned equipment, notes from officers who clearly knew things were falling apart and kept trying anyway. You understand what happened here before it's explained to you. People who played RE2 years ago can probably still map it from their memory. They probably know where the shortcuts are, where the safe rooms are, where you're going to spend most of your time. That's not because the layout is simple, but it's because the game makes you understand it so completely that it just stays. And another big strength I did want to talk about was the AB system, the zapping system. I think it's a really cool concept, and I'm pretty sad that it didn't come back in the remake, because I think that's the only thing that held the remake back a little bit. But it really added replay value where you actually have differences in the campaigns. Everybody already knows the answer here. You know it, I know it, the box art knows it, the name knows it. It's Nemesis. Every Resident Evil game before this one placed its enemies. You entered a room, you read the threat, dealt with it, and the room was done. Even encounters that felt tense were fundamentally predictable once you understood the game's logic. This hallway has 2 zombies, this room has a licker on the ceiling. The structure was built around mastering specific spaces and learning what each one contained, but Nemesis completely changed everything. Well, not completely, because there was Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, but Nemesis is a whole other monster. He'll show up when you least expect it, and there's really not anything you can do to stop him. He just basically feels like a stronger version of Mr. X who's a lot more intimidating, and part of that is because unlike Resident Evil 2 with Mr. X who's just following you, with seemingly no motivation, Nemesis' entire direction is to eliminate every STARS member. And the encounters are also built around to give you real choices in a way earlier bosses just didn't have. There's no correct answer on how you want to approach Nemesis. You can try to shoot at him, but it's usually not going to work well. Usually you're just going to run away. But you also have to think about where you're going to go next. So it feels like a live decision every time he shows up rather than just something scripted. RE3 and RE2 share a lot of the same DNA, but without Nemesis, RE3 is essentially a slightly different version of the game that came out years before. Code Veronica is a very underrated game, and I think the Resident Evil game that deserves a remake the most, and if rumors are to be believed, we are getting one soon. We get Wesker here, we get Alexia Ashford, who I think is one of the biggest strengths of this game. Her experiments with the T Veronica virus are incredibly interesting, because she believes she's shaping the future of humanity, and that her own exceptional intellect has earned her the right to do whatever she wants with it. She puts herself in cryogenic stasis for 15 years to let the virus slowly bond with her biology, rather than consume it, just because she's that motivated to be something more than human. And unlike a lot of other Resident Evil villains, where they're just kind of cartoonishly evil, the game takes her very seriously. She's not presented as deluded or tragic the way someone like Birkin is. She's not as over the top as Wesker, but she feels more grounded here. And then the rest of the game builds a strong enough frame around her that the eventual confrontation carries weight, and the entire vibe of this game just feels like Resident Evil without being a numbered Resident Evil game. Moving from Rockport Island to the Antarctic facility, 2 locations on opposite ends of the world, to show how much control Umbrella really has. Claire's search for Chris makes the story a lot more personal because it's a beloved character, but I feel like Alexia is the reason Code Veronica has a lasting identity, as well as just the overall vibe of the game, and I know that may be hard to quantify, but I think a lot of people who played this game will kind of understand what I'm saying here. Now, Code Veronica has real problems. The backtracking can be pretty awful here, if I'm being honest, but if you can get past that, and especially if a remake comes out that suits some of these things over, this game has a lot to love as a Resident Evil fan. Leon Kennedy has of course appeared in a number of games in the series and is practically the poster child for Resident Evil, but RE4 is where his personality really started to shine. In RE2, he's a rookie cop on September 30th, 1998, but he's better trained and maybe the funniest video game character ever here. Find a game where someone says something as funny as this.
No way, Leon.
Way.
He carries the entire game with his one-liners and over-the-top antics, and it's one of the things I miss most from the remake. Honestly, if a lot of this was in the remake, I would like it a lot better. Yes, it's very cheesy, and doesn't really go well with a serious tone, but it's just so funny here, and a bunch of his one-liners made me laugh. So while I do understand that the remake wanted to be more serious, and they kind of limited that, it's something I look forward to every time I replay this game. But this game also has so many more strengths. It of course went with a lot more action than previous games, but it still felt like a Resident Evil game. The reason I went with Leon as the biggest strength here is just because I really couldn't pinpoint one. The story and characters, the village itself, the gunplay, the overall vibe of the game, the pacing, it was just hard to pick one. I think this is probably the oldest Resident Evil game that is still fairly easy to pick up for someone who didn't grow up with the originals. The first 3 games, Zero and Code Veronica, all have tank controls with fixed cameras, which was intentional, but can be very tough to pick up and get used to if you didn't grow up with it. And while RE4 has tank controls, it doesn't have the fixed camera and takes far less time to get used to. It still holds up extremely well, and I can still recommend this to people even with the remake out. Resident Evil 5's biggest strength is not in the campaign, and that might be a frustrating answer, but the campaign of RE5 is very hit or miss. It's fine, it's fun in co-op, but it's also pretty much the same experience repeated for the whole runtime. Pretty much the best thing I could say about the RE5 campaign is just Wesker himself. But then there's Mercenaries, and Mercenaries did exist before RE5, it was introduced in RE3, but RE5 expands it into just a full combat sandbox. And the difference is pretty significant here. The premise again is simple. You enter an arena, fight as many enemies as possible before the timer runs out, build a score multiplier, and basically don't die. The simplicity is the whole point here, and without a story campaign pulling focus, every mechanic theme just asks how well you can actually operate. Every shot either maintains your combo or breaks it. Every positioning decision either keeps you controlling the crowd or gives the crowd control of you. Melee chains that feel optional in the campaign become essential tools for keeping the multiplier alive, and nothing's really irrelevant here. 5's combat was built pretty much exactly for this. The game pushes crowd control and spatial awareness harder than most entries in the series, and Mercenaries is where those priorities become the entire game. Reading how enemies move, predicting where the next group is coming from, finding the sequence that lets you keep attacking without getting surrounded, and of course the motivation to just keep getting a higher score. When you play with someone who knows what they're doing here, it's even more fun, and is one of the most satisfying parts of this game. As a mainline entry of Resident Evil, it's not a great game. I actually just replayed it pretty recently, and of course it barely feels like a Resident Evil game, but Mercenaries is just so fun. If I had to go with the strength for the main story, I would have to go with Wesker himself here. And since Wesker, we really haven't seen a villain quite like him, especially not Timo Wesker from Requiem.
Resident Evil 6.
So RE6 is a mess, and I'm not going to spend time pretending otherwise. With that said, I don't think this is a bad game. I think it's a fun game for what it is. I think it drags on a little too long, but it is worth playing if you're a Resident Evil fan. But the interesting thing about RE6 though, even though it is chaotic, is that the combat system here is actually really good. On the surface, it looks like every other third-person action game. You just aim, you shoot, you move on. But if you start actually experimenting with the controls, found something no previous Resident Evil game had come close to. You could dive sideways while firing, roll across the ground, slide into an enemy and chain directly into a melee attack, get knocked down and shoot from your back while getting back up. And these aren't cinematic either, they're just mobility options in the game, and it is the most fun part of Resident Evil 6. The stamina gauge keeps it from falling apart. Every physical action has a cost, which means aggression has a ceiling. If you spam melee too hard, then you get exposed when the next enemy closes in. And that does keep this from just being a mindless action game. Well, maybe this is a mindless action game anyway, but you know what I'm saying. The point is, there is some strategy here. I'd say a problem with this though is that the campaign never really slows down enough to teach any of this. It's just so relentlessly over the top and busy. The most players get through the whole thing on autopilot. Like, you may not even realize all the depth here until you're pretty far into the campaign. It is kind of frustrating here, because something like this in Resident Evil 5 I feel would have made it a much better game. Resident Evil 5 for me still feels extremely clunky to play, especially since I just played it. But you know what? Credit where credit is due to RE6. By 2017, the series had spent roughly a decade building itself into something that had very little to do with horror. RE5 was a co-op action game with zombies in it. RE6, which we just went over, was just a blockbuster trying to fit 4 different game identities into one package, and mostly succeeding in none of them, even if it was kind of fun. The question wasn't really whether Resident Evil had become an action franchise, because it clearly had. The question was whether anyone at Capcom still knew how to make it scary, or whether that was just all in the past. RE7 answers that in about the first 20 minutes, and it pretty much led the Resident Evil revival that we're still seeing today, where the series is more popular than ever. So this was my first Resident Evil game. I'd heard of the series, but I hadn't played it before 2017. And I'm glad this is a game I started with, because this is just a great survival horror game, and quotations around horror, because this game is scary. Perhaps the biggest change was going first person. All previous Resident Evil games were third person, but that lets you see the character and understand your position more. It gives you more space between you and any enemies or anything. But with first person, it removes that entirely. The ceiling feels lower, the sounds feel closer. When something moves in the corner of your vision, there's no camera pulling back to help you process it, and the field of view feels very narrow here. The Baker estate looks like a house that real people lived in before whatever happened to them. Photographs on walls, a dining room set for a family meal that never got eaten, home videos sitting around that you'll eventually wish you hadn't watched, and the Bakers weren't always whatever they were now. Now, that being said, on a side note, it is still kind of funny how the keys are hidden, with the very tropey survival horror keys and everything like that. But anyway, moving on. Jack Baker and the Baker family is one of the best things to happen in the series in a long time. He wanders around, he calls out to you through walls with a cheerful friendliness that makes every encounter worse. He has some incredible one-liners.
You thought you'd just slip out before dinner was done? I got the gift running all through me. All through me.
He just randomly smashes through walls, and what makes it scarier is that in RE4, 5, and 6, you feel like a trained professional. You have a ton of ammo, you're someone who has a lot of experience with taking down bioweapons, but in this you play as Ethan Winters, who has very limited experience with a gun, very limited ammo, very limited healing, and that just makes it scarier. Like, imagine playing this game as Leon or Chris. This clearly took a lot of inspiration from the Spencer Mansion and from RE1 in general, but unlike that game that came out in the 90s, RE7 looked very good at the time. It's a lot easier to find a game scary when it looks like this compared to this. So Village is basically like 4 or 5 different games stitched together under one title. Not as chaotic as Resident Evil 6, but still has a lot of variety, and how that works for you is completely subjective. Castle Dimitrescu feels very Resident Evil, where you're just exploring a giant castle with gothic themes. And of course, a 9-foot-tall vampire lady walks behind you trying to track you down. Then there's Reservoir, the factory, the ending, which feels like a completely different game. And while I think Village is a very good game, albeit a little bit of a mess, I pretty much like all the areas here. But my favorite here, and my favorite part of the game, was House Beneviento. So if you couldn't tell, I like when Resident Evil has that more survival horror feeling. It doesn't mean that's the only thing I care about in the series. My favorite is Resident Evil 4, which is not a scary game, but it is still something I really do appreciate from the series. Village is a much more action-oriented game compared to 7. You have more combat options, you have more ammo, there's more enemies. But once you get into House Beneviento, it really changes up. Your inventory disappears when you walk in, and you stop seeing enemies around every corner. You see very disturbing imagery, and things seem quiet, almost too quiet, and then you see this giant baby enemy, who is maybe one of the most disturbing creatures we've ever seen in the entire series. The Beneviento section is short, but by the time you leave, Village is back to being Village with bigger encounters, more action, just escalating the pace with a lot more action. But for me, the biggest strength was House Beneviento, but this is just my own personal opinion on it, so feel free to disagree, but I would have liked to get a little more sections like this in the game. Resident Evil Village tried to be more of an action game with some horror elements, but it felt pretty messy, albeit it was still a really fun game. But Requiem did a fantastic job combining both without feeling disjointed. You play as a new character named Grace, who is the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft from the Outbreak games, and she's an FBI agent with very little combat experience. She has a pistol and probably hadn't used it for anything more than like basic training. The first big area in the game is the hospital, where you get introduced to the girl who's one of the game's stalker enemies, and it feels like a horror game. You have limited inventory space, limited guns and ammo, and you can't do any backflips or anything over the top. I don't think it's super scary or anything, but it certainly was stressful and felt like survival horror. Then of course you also play as Leon, who represents the action part of Resident Evil. Inventory space as big as the boulder that Chris punched, the ability to take enemies' weapons like chainsaws and use them against them, an axe that you have the entire time and just need to sharpen, and of course a ton of ammo and combat options. The first half is mostly Grace, while the second half is mostly Leon, and I thought it worked tremendously. It made sense to have two vastly different protagonists represent these two genres, and their stories were still interconnected without feeling like Capcom was just trying to piece it together. Overall, I really love Requiem. The hospital was easily my favorite area, and the new zombies here were some of my favorite enemies in the series because they had so much variety. Another big strength was just Leon here, because what he lacked in unnecessary backflips, he also made up for with his one-liners.
Or we can begin your treatment. Silent treatment, I hope.
Some scenes in Raccoon City were also just so stupidly over the top that I couldn't help but smile. Now with all that being said, this game is still very fresh in my mind. I wouldn't be surprised if I remade this video in a year and had something else to say, but for now this is what I think the biggest strength is. When people argue about what a good remake looks like, this game comes up almost immediately, and it's not hard to understand why. Most remakes fall into one of two failure modes. They either stay so close to the original that you wonder why the remake exists. Think something like The Last of Us Part 1, where the remake is technically the definitive version of the game, but it just was so unnecessary that people didn't really care. Or they changed so much that the thing you loved about the original doesn't survive the translation. The 2002 remake somehow avoids both, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. The original had a strong foundation. The Spencer Mansion worked, which we already went over. The structure of gradual unlocking, puzzle solving, and slowly learning a space worked. Instead of replaying any of that, the remake treats it as something worth preserving and builds on top of it. The layout is recognizable enough that returning players feel at home immediately, and then the game starts revealing how much has changed. New areas like the graveyard, the cabin in the woods, and the redesigned underground sections don't feel like padding here. They feel like parts of the mansion that were always there and you just hadn't seen them yet. The visual overhaul also deserves more credit than it usually gets for how specifically it serves atmosphere rather than simply just looking better. The pre-rendered backgrounds just look so much better here, they're so much more detailed, and there's a lot more things to notice. The mansion just feels bigger here, it feels more oppressive, and the original hardware just couldn't achieve these things. Then there's the Crimson Head system, which is the addition that people talk about the most with this game. In the original, a dead zombie stayed dead. Pretty simple. Here, if you don't burn the body or destroy the head properly, it's going to reanimate to something faster and nastier. One mechanic rewrites the logic around every basic enemy in the game, and killing a zombie is no longer automatically the right call. Sometimes conserving ammo and avoiding the body is smarter. Sometimes you need to commit to a permanent solution because you know you'll be back through this hallway like 6 more times. Conservation here is much more important. Now I could go over specific gameplay aspects, but I feel like I kind of be repeating myself from the original. I just want to talk about how great of a remake this is. It basically just took the original and made a far better version of it. And I know there's people who prefer the original, but I'd say the vast majority like the remake better. And don't get me wrong, I love the other remakes, well, most of them, but they feel like fundamentally different games. This feels like the same game, but just a lot better. The obvious thing to praise about the RE2 remake is how good it looks, and it does look incredible even for a PS4 game that's 7 years old now, but that was never the hard part. Of course a 2019 game on a modern engine looks better than a 1998 PlayStation game. The actual challenge was whether Capcom could translate a fixed camera survival horror game into a fully controllable third-person experience without hollowing out what made it scary. Fixed cameras worked the way they did because they controlled information. The designer decided what you could see and when, and that limitation was the whole horror mechanism in the game. It made you uncertain, it made more familiar rooms feel more threatening. swing. Switching to full player-controlled perspective could have traded all of that away for modern conventions, and plenty of horror games have made exactly that trade and come out the other side feeling like action games with good lighting. Instead, the remake compensates through enemy design. Zombies in the 2019 version don't go down cleanly. A headshot might stagger them, but doesn't necessarily kill them. Second one might drop them, or they might keep crawling. If you unload half your pistol magazine into one, they might stand back up like 2 minutes later. Whether you prefer fixed camera angles and tank controls, or the more modern over-the-shoulder view, the latter is what modern game design typically is. Fixed camera angles are not very common in games anymore, so when it came time for this remake, Capcom had to translate this into a much more modern game, and they did a fantastic job. Now, of course, this was not the first game on the RE engine. We got Resident Evil 7. That was a brand new game. This was taking something from the 90s and modernizing it, and it has most of the improvements you'd want. But then there's Mr. X, who was in the original game, of course, but he's in kind of just scripted moments. But in the remake, he patrols large sections of the police station, and you hear him before you see him. He has those heavy footsteps that make you just freak out if you're trying to do a task. And it can get annoying, especially my favorite example being in the library when you're trying to just move the bookshelves around and he just gets in the way. But it definitely does add tension, you can't deny that. What the RE2 remake proved was that these games could still be great. The stories, the locations, even some of the puzzles still do work for a modern audience, just with the modern translation of it. And if you prefer the original, that's totally fine. But really, outside of like the zapping system, which this game doesn't have, I personally find this to be a much better game. Just my preference though, don't hate me. So the RE3 remake loses a lot from its source material. Compressed locations, a shorter campaign, which is like 3 hours for some people. Nemesis reduced from a persistent threat to a series of well-produced but predictable boss arenas. Those are just huge losses here, because the original Resident Evil 3 with all its quirks is still a fun game. So if I had to choose one strength, which was not the easiest thing for this, I'd say the dodge mechanic. The original RE3 had a dodge too, technically. It was notoriously inconsistent, and I actually picked this as the biggest flaw in Resident Evil 3. The timing window just seemed super inconsistent, and there was like no feedback. You couldn't really tell how you missed, and it seemed more RNG based than skill based. The remake's version is just much cleaner here. The timing window is readable, the animations give you clear feedback on whether it connected. When Jill sidesteps or lunges or slips out of a grab, you know exactly why it worked, and it just makes the game feel better. Like, the movement and combat is not the problem in this game. The slow motion window on a perfect dodge is what makes it really satisfying rather than simply functional. And it is a minor thing here, but it does feel really good to use in this game, because the game itself looks great, feels great to play. The only issue is that it just cut so much content. I kind of lost a lot of the charm of the original Resident Evil 3. Remaking RE4 was probably the hardest job in the franchise's history, because the original is one of the most studied and imitated games ever made, and almost everyone who works in game design has a strong opinion about it. After the 2 and 3 remake, a lot of people were expecting this, but unlike those games, this was more modern. There still were tank controls, didn't feel the same though because there wasn't a fixed camera, and I think it just holds up a lot better than the previous games. So it was interesting to see what Capcom was going to do with this, and unlike 2 and 3, which I tried out after I played the remakes, Resident Evil 4 I played the original first. I'd played 7, I played Village, I played the 2 and 3 remakes, and I wanted to see what all the hype about Resident Evil 4 was about, and it was just a fantastic game, and I loved it start to finish. Well, maybe not start to finish. There was one specific section that I went over in my last video. Overall, the game is a masterpiece and one of my favorites of all time. So when this remake was announced, people were very curious. Was it going to be redundant? Was it going to do what Resident Evil 3 did and just cut so much content? Well, when it came out, we pretty much got that answer. It's a really fantastic game, and I go back and forth on if I prefer the original or the remake, but I think there's reasons to play both. Now, we could argue about certain spectacles in this game, about certain dialogue, but things I don't really think you could argue in favor of the original is just how great the combat is here. Leon can now parry incoming attacks, he can deflect a chainsaw swing, intercept a thrown weapon, interrupt an enemy mid-lunge in last possible moment. Successfully parrying opens a brief window to counter, which means the knife went from the last resort in the original to a pretty active part of most fights here, and the Ganados have been redesigned around the assumption that you have this tool. They're more aggressive here, they're more willing to flank, they're more coordinated here, and of course with modern quality of life improvements, the gun combat is just infinitely better here. The weapon handling is just way more distinct, with differences in recoil, reload timing, damage output, and of course the original had this, but it wasn't as pronounced. The environments contribute too. Like, most major areas have interactive elements scattered throughout them, whether it's ladders, explosive barrels, breakable structures that redirect the enemy movement. The level design really expands on the original, and it feels like you just have a lot more agency here. Now, like I said, the original RE4 was still great, and even with the tank controls, I still think it's perfectly fine to play today. And you'll see people argue back and forth about which game is better, and it doesn't really matter, it's your own personal choice. My recommendation is play both of them, because they're both still fantastic games, but I do have to give props to the remake for just having far better combat.
Resident Evil Revelations.
So Revelations is an interesting game. As I've went over, Resident Evil was pretty much just an action game for a long time. RE4 was more action-oriented, RE5 went even further in that direction, and then, well, RE6 happened. But during that trajectory, something showed up on the 3DS a lot of people didn't really expect, and it wasn't a mainline game, but it was Resident Evil Revelations. It tried to be a survival horror game, and it mostly succeeded, but of course being a 3DS game it was limited, and it was later ported, but still, being a game made for the 3DS, it wasn't like a traditional Resident Evil adventure. But the cruise ship setting here was really well designed in my opinion. You typically think of a cruise ship of being very luxurious, but this of course was abandoned and dark, and there was no city outside the window and no population to stumble across because you were just on the ship and the water around it. Compared to everything around it in the series, including the ship in RE7, this fits the game perfectly. Like on Zenobia, the danger feels like something you're enclosed in, and the corridors are narrow enough that you hear something approaching before you can see it. Rooms feel smaller than they are because of the darkness and the water on the floor, and the persistent sense that standing still is a bad idea. You gotta navigate carefully here, and with it being a 3DS game and being on a smaller scale, that does kinda affect the horror here. And then there's the Uzier, which I think fit the environment better than like RE5's enemies. They're slow and distorted, and they emerge from the space in ways that feel unpredictable. They aren't the most aggressive enemies, and they're just kind of present, but they kind of just fits the tone. Like, I don't know how to really explain it. Now, Revelations does have stretches where it leads more into action harder than the ship setting really supports, and the story tries to do it in too little time. I don't think Revelations is a fantastic game, but I think the Zenobia is a cool location, and I think it makes it worth playing, especially if you're playing a console version compared to the 3DS version. But I would definitely say that's the biggest strength of this game.
Resident Evil.
Now on to its sequel. I think raid mode is the reason Revelations 2 still has an active audience. The campaign is good, it has a solid atmosphere, has 10 sections. Barry Burden, of course, being an extremely welcome presence. But raid mode is what turned a game people played once into something they kept returning to. Now, it wasn't Revelations 1, you unlocked it early in the campaign rather than at the end, and the later console ports made it available from the start. But what Revelations 2 does is take that foundation and build a full progressive system on top of it. Character skill trees that meaningfully change how someone performs in combat, weapon drops with randomized stats and attributes. One shotgun might prioritize raw damage while another one has a critical hit bonus. Ability unlocks that let you shape a character around specific approaches, whether that's something with close range or precision shooting. The layering is what separates this from a score attack. Like, your character after 50 hours of raid mode is functionally different from your character after 5, and that creates a reason to come back that skill improvement alone can't sustain. Some stages might have you clear a map quickly, others might drive you into wave survival. When playing with someone whose build covers your weakness without either of you having to explain it, or you're just both like doing what you need to do, it's one of the most satisfying co-op experiences the series has put together. The campaign of Revelations 2 is worth your time. I think it's a solid game, but raid mode is really what people look for in this game. Outbreak had terrible timing. Came out in late 2003 in Japan and rolled out globally through 2004. And this was at a time when online console gaming was still in its awkward phase. Broadband internet wasn't universal, and setting up online play on the PS2 required effort most people just were not going through at this time. A lot of players experienced the whole thing offline with AI partners, which is not how it was built to work. And in that context, a game designed entirely around cooperative online survival came across as a neat concept that hadn't quite come together. The concept itself, though, which was co-op survival horror built around ordinary civilians, was a really ambitious and interesting idea. Most Resident Evil games give you a trained professional or someone who could credibly become one under pressure, but Outbreak takes that away entirely. You're a waitress, a surgeon, a university student. Nobody in the cast has military training. Nobody has prior experience with any of this. These are just ordinary people. And the game shows whether regular people can survive a city falling apart, which is a different question than most of the games. Each character plays to who they actually are, and some are better in a fight. Some have utility skills, item crafting, specific environmental interactions, healing, and that makes them valuable without being combat capable. The self-contained episodes covering different parts of Raccoon City, like a hotel, a hospital, a subway system, all create variety while feeding into the same story of what's happening in Raccoon City. And then there's the infection mechanic, which keeps the stakes permanent regardless of how skilled your group is. From the first moment of a scenario, the T-virus is working on everyone, and the percentage ticking upward with or without enemy contact. Resources in combat can slow what happens, but can't stop the clock entirely. Even a perfectly executed run is racing toward an ending, which does make you play more urgently. What RE5 eventually built around co-op was more polished and more accessible, but the specific idea of ordinary people trying to survive the city, and that being an online co-op game, was a really great idea that I would love to see a remake of, because this game is not perfect. It has kind of aged a little rough. Imagine if this was on the RE engine. Obviously, for a long time, online co-op has been very accessible, so this game was kind of just ahead of its time in some ways.
Resident Evil Outbreak File 2.
And now the final game I want to go over is Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. So it doesn't try to reinvent what the original Outbreak established. It's just trying to show how much further that foundation can go, and the answer turns out to be considerably further. The new scenarios cover distinct ground: an infected zoo where the animals are part of the problem, a university campus spreading with Outbreak in real time, a flooded district, and each location has its own hazards and objectives and atmosphere, different enough from one another that cycling through them doesn't feel like revisiting the same space. There's a lot of variety here, but it's not the main thing that separates this from its predecessor. That would just be how much each scenario branches. Two groups running the same mission with different characters regularly have different experiences, different routes, different events triggered or missed, different endings, and with all of this, that makes this a very replayable game. Like, the game will keep giving you something you hadn't seen yet, which is not something that every game can do, especially games like this. Each survivor has skills that unlock specific approaches to situations, and certain paths only open up for certain characters, certain puzzles have shortcuts so only some can access, certain combat encounters play out very differently depending on who's handling them, and returning to a mission you finished as one character and running it again as someone completely different can be a fundamentally different experience. The infection mechanic returns unchanged from the original, which was the right call because it kept urgency alive no matter how well you knew the map, and you could have a scenario memorized and still feel the pressure of the timer climbing. I think File 2 is just the better game. It takes what made the original work and just makes it a much more replayable game. And that's every Resident Evil game's biggest strength. Now, I know there's some I didn't include like spin-offs, but I haven't played any of those, and they're mostly completely separate from anything traditional Resident Evil. Be sure to like and subscribe if you liked this video, and also check out these videos on screen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.